The Paris Olympics have arrived. I'm Niall Paterson, welcome to The Daily. And look, ordinarily at this point, we'd all be looking forward to the opening ceremony and the games getting started properly. Instead, a series of arson attacks have brought the French railway network to its knees.
It's probably a large-scale sabotage with some malicious acts, probably.
Our Europe correspondent is Adam Parsons. He's out in Paris where I suppose people are perhaps not quite as excited as they might have been. What do we know about these so-called arson attacks?
So what we know is that there were a series of attacks on the railway network. Now, in some ways, Neil, what we know is irritatingly vague because we don't have the specifics that we'd have wanted. We've seen images of cables that have been damaged, but these are in various locations, not here in Paris, but the high-speed lines that go out towards the Atlantic coast and then towards the northeast and the northwest. We know that there was another attack that was foiled in the southeast when railway workers saw people acting suspiciously. So we know that this damage was done to the network. We know that it has caused a huge amount of disruption with hundreds of thousands of people having their journeys disrupted. But I think crucially, we also know that the French government is treating this as coordinated sabotage. This is somebody who is clearly trying to disrupt these Olympics. And let's be blunt, it's not easy. Carrying out these sort of coordinated attacks is not an easy task.
It certainly isn't, and it speaks to the sophistication of whoever ultimately was behind this. But whilst they're being described in terms of an arson attack, malicious acts of vandalism, I mean, the one word that has not been bandied around by French authorities is terrorism.
Yeah, interestingly, earlier on, I went to interview the French sports minister, Amélie Oudéa-Castéra, who we were expecting to talk to about the Olympic Games, about the preparation. That interview had to start late because before speaking to us, she'd been in a call with other ministers, with officials in a crisis meeting to discuss what had happened and how they can respond. Now, there are two elements that I would take from that interview. One, that Ms. Oudéa-Castéra was emotional. She said she was stressed. She said she was angry. I felt that at one point she was almost sort of close to tears. She was furious with what had happened. The second thing I'd say, Neil, is this. I said to her, could this have been Russia? Could this have been terrorism? And you know that at times like that, people normally say, well, let's not speculate. What she said was possibly. She then went on to say, we don't know. But she didn't rule it out straight away. She said possibly. It's very clear to me that that was something that had been raised, and I don't think as a definite answer, but certainly as something that the intelligence services here in France must be looking into.
And I suppose if we want to try and elucidate the motivations of those who were responsible at this, we should look at the outcomes. I mean, was this attack designed to simply disrupt the Olympics? Was it designed to humiliate the French authorities? I mean, speaking of the French authorities, I mean, Emmanuel Macron all the way back in April said, I have no doubt whatsoever, including in terms of information, i.e. data that has been passed directly to him, that Russia was planning something around the Olympics.
And look, take a step back. Why do countries host the Olympics? It costs a fortune. It causes an enormous amount of disruption. It's just a sports event. Why do you host this? Answer, because it is a projection of a nation. It is a projection of power, of confidence, competence. It is the world looking to France. What is the last thing that the French would have wanted is something like this happening, something that is embarrassing, that it throws into question their ability to hold big events, that it angers the French people. So yes, if you were seeking to do something to undermine the impact of this huge sporting event, I guess this is exactly the sort of thing that you might do. It doesn't involve getting into stadiums. It doesn't involve loss of life. It isn't sort of terrorism in that classic sense. But what it does cause is a vast amount of disruption and a certain amount of embarrassment to France, which we should say, by the way, G7 country, one of the wealthiest nations in the world, senior figure in NATO, senior figure in the United Nations, exactly the sort of country that, if you were the Russian president, you might just want to pick on.
I have to ask what the reaction has been domestically to these arson attacks. I suspect that for many Parisians it will have been met with nothing more than a shrug of the shoulders and a very Gallic boff, but elsewhere I suspect that people will be concerned.
I think both of those things can happen simultaneously, to be honest, Neil. So you go to a station and you do get the shrug. I mean, let's be honest, pretty much everyone who's listening to this will at some point have been on a train that's been cancelled or delayed. So to an extent, that is what everybody who's at a railway station is thinking to themselves. And yes, I spoke to people at stations and I had both those things. Yes, I'm annoyed, I'm angry, I'm very disappointed. What I don't sense is a kind of blame being directed towards the government or towards the Olympic organisers. I think there is a feeling that some malign actors have done this, and that among the French population, there's kind of anger towards those people rather than any blame being piled onto the organisers. Once the opening ceremony starts, once you get into the main body of the sport, big if, there are no more acts of disruption like this one, I suspect that the sport might just overtake everything. But you are right. For the moment, for the organisers, for the government, for everyone involved, there are enough nerves around staging the Olympics. This has added a lot of tension that they just didn't want.
It takes me back to 2012 in London, and I will hold my hands up and admit to being one of those cynics who was saying the capital is going to grind to a halt. This is going to be the worst thing to have ever hit London. And, about 2 days into it, I've got my London 2012 hat on and heading down to the Olympic Village and doing everything. It turned out to be a great event, largely because the sport came along and did take over. There weren't the problems that people had anticipated. But we go back to where we first started. There is a huge tension, isn't there, between ensuring that an event on this scale is safe, but also still enjoyable and practical to attend.
First of all, I like the admission that Niall Paterson admits to being a cynic. I would like to see this image of you in full London 2012 regalia. Look, your main point, Neil, is of course right. And in a sense, it goes back to that fundamental question, why do cities go to all this trouble to host the Olympics? And it is to project the city and also to kind of bring together the nation. That's what happened in London 2012. I've been lucky. I've been to a number of Olympic Games. And that's what happens generally, is that there's this stardust that people just generally feel in a better mood. They feel more engaging, more welcoming. But in order to get that stardust, people who go to events have to feel that they are doing something extraordinary, something special, and fundamentally something safe. My feeling would be that this might yet be considered an aberration. If something else happens, then suddenly people will start thinking, well, do I want to go? Is it safe? Let's remember there are other pinch points at stake here. This isn't just about somebody, whoever it might have been, doing acts of sabotage. The Israelis are taking part in these Olympics, and there will no doubt be acts of protest around that. And things always happen at Olympics, surprising things that can disrupt. So there is that question, but the fundamental question, will a spectator feel safe if they are at an event? I think at the moment, you come here, all around these streets, there's a lot of people enjoying themselves, a lot of bonhomie, people who've come to Paris because they want to be part of this event. But it doesn't take that much for people to start getting just a bit more nervous.
Adam, thanks very much indeed. Stay where you are. In a moment, we will be back with one of those who worked on security for the London 2012 Games. Providing security for the Olympics is clearly a Herculean task, but given the Games do happen every 4 years, well, there's plenty of past experience to lean upon. Steve Park is a security analyst who worked in security for the London Olympics back in 2012. Steve, good to see you again. Look, you have been looking, of course, at what has been happening in France and indeed the authorities' response to it. What do you make of it?
I think the French are always going to give a very, very robust response. It's of no surprise at all. They use many different types of police and military in this case. It's one of the biggest security operations in France that they'll have seen. I think in modern times, they're obviously very well aware that the transport systems coming into Paris are paramount. They will be monitoring the train stations, obviously the trains coming in, but also importantly, people driving in cars as well, using the automatic number plate recognition system, who owns the vehicles, where the intelligence is from the police, who are looking at the owners' names, who are the passengers. There's a ring of steel around Paris. We know steel fencing has gone up. We know there are more or less 45,000 additional police and troops been brought into central Paris for the opening ceremony. We know there's a no-fly zone for the opening ceremony. And using that dome system that we used in 2012, which detects obviously anything that's flying through that dome at any time during the opening ceremony.
So a huge amount of manpower, kit, resources at the French disposal. And I would suggest that just looking at where these attacks have been targeted, very much pinpointing fault points within the railway network, does suggest a degree of sophistication on the part of the attacker.
It would have taken a group of people, whether the police know of them, have identified them, whether they're fanatical, or whether it does come down to terrorism, we're not quite sure. The railway system was always going to be under fire. It would happen in any country. Very, very difficult to police, or the whole line, or the lines coming into Paris. It's a huge stretch, and it could be interrupted anywhere along the line. A very, very difficult job. And obviously, as the games progress, the different kinds of threats will become more obvious. The ones that are being aimed, depending on whether that's at the actual athletes themselves, the organisation, Paris itself, or the destinations of the different Olympic events. Very, very difficult to hold an event like this in such a busy city. When people have to carry on their daily lives, you have the protection of the people of Paris to look out for, the athletes themselves, the organisers. In terms of people, it doesn't get much more complicated than at this time.
So how then does one coordinate so many different agencies, so many different departments, so that you have this protective shield wrapped around the Paris Olympics?
It's called a multi-layered security event. So the planning would have started to happen 4 years ago, when they knew that Paris was going to be used for these Olympic Games. So if you can imagine Paris being the epicenter, there will be rings drawn around Paris. Those rings will denote in kilometres where equipment will be stored, where it may be most vital to keep it, whether that's police equipment, whether that's military equipment. If they're going to be using anti-Rapier missile systems, so they're fixed systems that are hidden within the city to combat any defence from above, those will be on tower blocks. We saw that in the 2012 games to give a 360-degree coverage. From my experience with the French police, I think they'll be super organised with this event. They know what they're doing. They've hosted many large events of recent times, and they'll have learned from those practices. The eyes are on Paris right here and right now. And I think that the military will try and stay out of the way as much as possible. But what they do need to be is there if something happens, and they need to be there en masse.
I suppose then, Steve, we should probably dwell on the similarities that there are between the Olympics in which you worked, 2012 here in London, and what's taking place in Paris. It is a huge, huge job. I mean, thinking back to your time in London 2012, I mean, a lot of the same preparations must have been made.
Yeah, it was complicated. The training was insufficient, and it didn't happen on time. And the knee-jerk reaction, which I believe was a very good one, was to bring in the military. It was very visible, but it did work, and it was immediate. They brought the military in, an amazing transformation of bringing in what is the military that work in theatre normally to work at a customer services level at most points that I saw in an excellent capacity. I cannot cover them with enough praise at 2012 in how they reformed the security. I think this is all a learning curve for the French authorities, where they'll take into account what has happened at many other different kinds of events and brought that into their infrastructure as intelligence to move forward in the best possible way. We know the French authorities are very hard. They're very, very tough. The moment they see their defences being affected, I believe they'll be able to bring in resources within a matter of minutes, certainly with the entrances and the exits of the ceremony tonight, within seconds. But that's going to be a ring of steel around that ceremony. There'll be several rings of multi-layered security. And unless you've got an invitation, you won't be getting in there any day soon.
Steve, will they have considered not moving forward with the opening ceremony?
No, I don't believe so. I think for all the events that I've ever monitored or worked on within the security industry, the security industry has to stay 1 point ahead of the people that are trying to thwart these games. The moment that the people win and a ceremony is postponed, then I think that's a nail in the coffin for democracy itself. I think that dynamically these events, they know there are threats. They know there are threats coming from organisations and threats from individuals. And it's up to that security planning. And that we see, that will be the legacy maybe of this Games.
I mean, with your security analyst hat on, as someone who has worked on events of this scale, tell me that a chill did not go up your spine when you heard that the French opening ceremony would not be taking place just in a stadium, but would be taking place along several miles of the River Seine.
This really is one of the big threat areas, probably, of the whole Games. The police, they're going to need to have their eye on the ball all of the time throughout this whole Olympics. But I think that this opening ceremony, if it's affected in any way, shape or form, I think it's going to leave a stain on the Olympics itself.
And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. I'm heading off on my hauls for a few days now, but The Daily is going nowhere and will return Monday in the capable hands of our political correspondent Liz Bates. For now, I'll see you again soon.